During World War II, the American army helped to liberate France and many countries in Europe. They fought ferociously following the D-Day landings, and they continued to destroy the Axis alliance even in the Pacific after the German surrender. But the US forces carried out a number of ruthless executions during the war, and this even included teenage Hitler Youth spies who were condemned. Despite their age being 17, the Americans strapped them to a wooden stake and then pulled the trigger. But at the end of World War II, they also executed a number of high-ranking German officials and military commanders. In this documentary, we look at 5 American firing squad executions of World War II, and to support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. Otto Skorzeny had become one of Adolf Hitler's reliable commandos and go-to men for secret operations. He had previously been involved in Operation Panzerfaust, a secret mission in which he oversaw the kidnapping and seizure of the son of Hungary's regent. When he returned to Hitler, he met with him at his Wolf's Lair headquarters on the 22nd of October 1944, and he received many accolades and congratulations, and he was briefed on the Ardennes offensive that Hitler planned to halt the Allied advancements. He was told that he was to be involved in a number of operations, but the main plan for him was to create a special brigade of soldiers called the Panzer Brigade 150, which would capture a number of bridges over the Meuse River. The aim was to take these before they could be blown up, and Hitler said that to allow this to be done quicker and with less losses, Skorzeny and his men would wear US Army uniforms that had been taken from soldiers. He said that having a small detachment of German soldiers in enemy uniform, it was believed would cause chaos with the enemy, and they could be hesitant to fire at what they believed was their own men. Hitler believed the Americans would be in disarray at seeing some of their own uniforms within the enemy, and Hitler said directly, "I want you to command a group of American and British troops and get them across the Meuse and seize one of the bridges. Not my dear Skorzeny, real Americans or British. I want you to create special units wearing American and British uniforms. They will travel in captured Allied tanks. Think of the confusion you could cause. I envisage a whole string of false orders which will upset communications and attack morale." But under the Hague Convention of 1907, this was considered rather controversial. Skorzeny and Hitler knew that if any of their soldiers were captured whilst in enemy uniform, then it was probable that they would be executed, being deemed as spies. Other field marshals discussed this point, but the order was given for the unit to wear American uniforms. But as the Ardennes offensive was beginning rapidly, Otto Skorzeny had only a short window of around 6 weeks to find his men for the job, and also to train them for Operation Grief. In the first 4 days of planning, he sent his plans for Panzer Brigade 150 to Alfred Jodl, and he asked for 3,300 men, and was then given the go-ahead whenever he was ready, and Jodl promised him all the support he needed. The OKW then issued an order asking for suitable soldiers for the operation who had a knowledge of the English language and also American dialect, and this note was passed to all the Wehrmacht's headquarters, and this was also leaked to the Allies. As well as having US Army uniforms, the brigade needed American vehicles, weapons and other equipment to successfully deceive. There would be no point a German soldier walking around in American uniform if they were sitting in Panthers with German army markings on. They needed 15 tanks, 20 armoured cars, 20 self-propelled guns, 100 jeeps, 40 motorbikes, 120 trucks and more uniforms. They could not get all of this equipment and only had 2 Sherman tanks that were gathered battered, and Skorzeny then had to use German hardware decorated with American markings. The brigade had lots of Polish and Russian equipment also, and Skorzeny also had 10 men who spoke good English and had knowledge of the US lifestyle and turns of phrase. Around 150 men spoke relatively good English, but most spoke none. Because of this, the Panzer Brigade 150 was reduced from 3 battalions to 2, and the best 150 English speakers became part of a commando unit. 2,500 men were gathered, and the equipment they had was very underwhelming. The Panther tanks were disguised to look like M10 tank destroyers. Rumours began circulating in the brigade that they were to help relieve besieged French towns such as Dunkirk, and that they would capture Antwerp. But later the commanders were made aware of the plans to capture at least 2 of the bridges over the Meuse River at Huy, Andenne and Amai before they could be blown up. The commandos of the group had little time to train, but were dressed in American uniforms, armed with American weapons and used US Army jeeps. They were given 3 missions. The first was that demolition squads of 6 men were to blow up bridges, ammunition dumps and fuel stores. The second was that recon patrols would watch both sides of the river and pass on fake orders to American units, and also remove minefield warnings. A third mission was that the lead commando groups would attack and disrupt the US chain of command, attacking telephone wires and radio stations. On the 14th of December 1944, Panzer Brigade 150 was gathered at Bad Münstereifel, and in the afternoon of the 16th they moved and advanced behind a number of attacking panzer divisions. They aimed to move around them, but following being halted, the mission in Skorzény's opinion was rather doomed. The following day he attended a conference and asked for his brigade to be used as a normal fighting detachment, and this was allowed. But on the 21st of December they tried to take the small village of Malmedy, and there were many assaults made by the brigade before they were fought back by the Americans to get a US armed detachment to withdraw. Because of the deceit, the Americans started asking soldiers questions that they believed only Americans would know, and this included sports trivia, and some high-profile members of the American army were even later held at gunpoint for getting a question wrong. Otto Skorzény's men had caused fear and had caused unease within the American ranks. With this, 44 German soldiers wearing American uniforms were sent through the American lines, and all but 8 came back initially. The Americans treated everyone with suspicion, but those who were captured were subject to execution as mentioned earlier, as they were wearing enemy uniforms. There was one massacre ordered by German General Anton Dostler in Italy, who ordered the executions of a number of American soldiers who had allegedly been caught wearing enemy uniforms, but this was not the case. The men who were captured by the Americans were shot dead and executed because of their accusation of being enemy spies. 3 named Pernas, Schmidt and Billing were brought to a military trial at Henry Chapelle on the 21st of December 1944 and were then sentenced to death for their work in sabotage. 3 more Germans were tried and sentenced to death on the 23rd of December. 7 more were tried on the 26th of December, and 3 more were tried on the 31st. These were all found guilty and were all sentenced to death to be executed. The executions of the men of Operation Grief occurred in a rather similar manner. They were all sentenced to death to be shot by firing squad, with the executioners being the US First Army. Firing squads were gathered, and in different areas makeshift firing ranges were made to execute the German saboteurs. In one execution of 3 German commandos, 3 wooden stakes were created against a small concrete building. The 3 men were led to their place of execution and were tied by the feet, and then their arms were tied behind their backs before they were secured by rope to the post. They were dressed in their clothes that they were captured in, then a mark was placed over their chests to show the firing squad where to aim. The men were then blindfolded, and the American military police who accompanied them stood back. Around 20 metres away stood the firing squads, who were armed with their rifles. They were then told to prepare and get ready, and when the signal was given, they shot straight into their targets, instantly killing the German soldiers who had been involved in Operation Grief. All of the men who were arrested and found in US Army uniform were sentenced to death and were executed in this manner, using firing squads. The team leader of Operation Grief, Gunther Schultz, was later tried in May 1945 and was then executed himself on the 14th of June 1945 by a firing squad of the US 9th Army. Otto Skorzeny was tried as a war criminal and was accused of violating the rules of war during the Battle of the Bulge. He and 9 officers of Panzer Brigade 150 were charged with improperly using US uniforms by entering into combat disguised therewith and treacherously firing upon and killing members of the armed forces of the United States. They were also accused of wrongfully obtaining US uniforms and Red Cross parcels, stealing those from prisoners of war. But the defendants were acquitted of their crimes, and with this Skorzeny escaped any further action. The executions of the men of Operation Grief were ultimately killed for their involvement in the deception attempts and the fact they were wearing enemy uniforms. They were all shot by firing squads made up of US soldiers, but the mastermind behind the whole operation escaped. Otto Skorzeny is a very interesting figure, and after the war he managed to escape from a prison camp and was eventually offered a job as a military advisor to the Egyptian president. He then became an advisor to Argentinian President Juan Perón, who allowed many former Nazis to settle in his lands after the Second World War. The Hitler Youth is considered today one of the most extreme organisations of the Third Reich. It was established by the Nazis, and it was a youth group that boys would join. It was more than just a youth club who would meet every week. It was a constant tool of indoctrination, and the young boys who would attend were raised in such a manner that they would one day become soldiers to fight for Hitler and the German army. Of course, many of those who were in their teenage years when the Hitler Youth was established were thrust into the conflict of the Second World War at some point, and very young boys were even involved in defending Berlin during the final days of the conflict. The membership to the Hitler Youth later became compulsory, and all German boys were in a sense forced to join and were pressurized to do so. Hitler claimed about the group that these boys enter our organizations with their 10 years of age and often for the first time get a little fresh air. After 4 years of the young folk, they go into the Hitler Youth, where they have another 4 years, and even if they are not still complete National Socialists, they go to the Labour Service and are smoothed out there for another 6-7 months, and whatever class consciousness or social status might be left, the Wehrmacht will take care of that. Inside of the Hitler Youth there were many different activities, from orienteering and map reading, that the boys would get involved in, and they then got involved in more shocking activities such as grenade throwing and rifle shooting. These were children at the end of the day, and many were forced to go, and they were informed that they would not be able to get a job or go to university unless they were a member of the group. It was mostly boys aged between 14 to 18 who joined, and at its peak 8 million boys were members of the Hitler Youth, and for Hitler this was a potential army for him. They even got involved during the Second World War in an auxiliary manner, and they took part in fire and rescue services following bombing raids, and they also worked inside of the postal services, on the railways and in other infrastructure roles. But as was obvious, Hitler wanted the majority of these young men thrust into the armed forces, and their training in the Hitler Youth helped the boys to become disciplined soldiers who would not question a word of the Nazi Party. There were some who defied, but they risked severe punishment, including being sent to a concentration camp along with their loved ones, and even execution. One former well-thought-of member of the Hitler Youth was Hans Scholl, who later was executed for being part of the White Rose resistance group, and he lost his head on the guillotine. But as the Second World War went against the Germans, and they lost a lot of soldiers, fighting especially the Soviet Red Army on the deadly Eastern Front, there were many members of the Hitler Youth who were called into military reserve to replace those who had died. Often these young men were not as skilled as others, and the inexperienced boys were fighting alongside the most battle-hardened German soldiers who had seen years of conflict. There were plans drawn up for SS divisions made up of the Hitler Youth, and members of this division would contain those who were born in 1926, and Hitler even signed off on this. But in 1944 the SS Panzer Division and the SS Panzer Division Hitler Youth did manage to take out 28 Canadian tanks. However, they lost 3,000 defending against Operation Overlord. These divisions, though, were known for their ardent support of Hitler, and they were some of the most ferocious fighters, as the brainwashing they had experienced had been going on for years. There were even later 12-year-olds ordered as mentioned to defend Berlin, and there are photographs in the dying days of the war with children clutching Panzerfaust projectile weapons to try and repel the Red Army. But one way in which the Hitler Youth was used on the battlefield, or certainly near the battlefields, was in espionage and spying. In the final months of the war, there were members of the Hitler Youth who were recruited to get involved in spy work for the Wehrmacht and the SS. The Nazis wanted these young boys to not arouse suspicion, and then infiltrate British, American and Allied lines, and then pass on information to the Wehrmacht about positions and other movements of Allied soldiers. They wanted these young men to pass on whatever they could find out, and near to the town of Braunschweig, in Germany, members of the Hitler Youth conducted spying on the Allies, and they passed information on to the Germans to try and rouse attacks to force the Allies back. But it wasn't long before the American army realised that they were being spied on, and they even suspected local girls and women for spying and interrogated them. The US military hierarchy also discouraged fraternisation with the local people, in case they would pass on military secrets and information. However, on the 1st of June 1945, the American army conducted a pair of executions as a young boy of 16 and another aged 17 was led out by US soldiers into a quarry. They were then tied to a stake and were forced to face a firing squad. Heinz Petrie was 16 years old and Joseph Schörner was 17. They had both been captured by the Americans and were suspected of being spies. They had been trained how to shoot and also how to deploy explosives for what was known as a Werwolf secret network, which had been established to disrupt the Allies. Schörner, the older boy, was a leader in the Hitler Youth, and he had been sent to Bergheim with other Hitler Youth members. On the 21st of February 1945, Heinz Petry joined them, and he, along with Schörner, worked close to the front lines, and they were spying on US military, masquerading as normal German boys, and they then informed the remaining parts of the German army what they had found. But it wasn't long before they were picked up. In fact, the next day they were arrested by members of the 9th US Army, close to the town of Bergden. The boys were hiding inside of a foxhole, and were caught red-handed, and they were importantly wearing civilian clothes, and they were not in uniform. If they had any form of German uniform or identifier on them, then this could have saved them, as they would have been treated as a prisoner of war, and not a spy. As they wore civilian clothes, they were dealt with as spies, and were brought in front of a US court-martial on the 29th of March 1945 in Mönchengladbach, and were charged with espionage that was damaging to the US war effort. They were tried before a jury, and these men passed a 2/3 majority in favour of the death sentence, and the US forces wanted to send a message to the German population that they would not put up with people spying on them, and specifically the Americans condemned the two teenagers to remove the poisonous breath of German militarism and Nazi ideology from the face of the earth completely. It was on the 30th of May 1945 that the two boys were moved to Braunschweig detention centre, ready for their execution, and despite appealing for clemency and a reprieve, this was not granted. Heinz Petry, who was 16 years old, wrote a long 6-page letter bidding his parents and brother goodbye the night before his execution. On the 1st of June 1945, Heinz Petry, being the younger of the two, was taken out of his prison cell, and he was led into a quarry by American military policemen and a priest who had been appointed to give him spiritual guidance in his final moments. Petry was secured to a wooden stake against the gravel bank of a quarry, and the policeman tied his arms behind his back, and then secured him to the post and tied his legs also to it. There was no escape for him. Then 12 US soldiers arrived from the 9th Army with their rifles by their sides, and they were stood not too far away from the target, and the commander in charge of the firing squad told his men to ready. They raised their rifles and shot straight into the 16-year-old Heinz Petry. Following his death, his body was collected by employees of the German Red Cross, and they placed it inside of a coffin. After Heinz Petry was shot, Joseph Schörner was next, and he was executed in the same way. There were 4 other spies who were executed that day by the 9th Army as executioners. The executions did not go by without controversy, as many believed that due to the age, the 2 boys should have not been executed and should have been spared. The boys were then buried in a nearby cemetery. These 2 executions were a stark warning to anyone inside of Germany how the Allies would deal with any potential resistance, and also those who spied upon them and tried to subvert their war effort. The US soldiers wanted to send a message, and by executing a 16-year-old and a 17-year-old they certainly did this. Heinz Petry and Joseph Schörner are today considered some of the youngest people to have been executed during the Second World War. Anton Dostler was born on the 10th of May 1891 inside of Munich in Germany. He had a normal upbringing, but at an early age he did sign up to become a member of the German armed forces and the military. Dostler joined the army in 1910, and this would begin his decades-long service inside of the armed forces. He began his life in the military as a junior officer, and he would serve during the First World War. It's not known how much action Dostler saw during World War I, but he would emerge as a respected member of the armed forces. He returned to life following the war, and he would become one of the men who remained inside of the limited German army. Following the end of World War I, the German army was restricted to 100,000 soldiers, and Dostler was part of what was known as a Reichsheer, and he would continue to rise into senior positions within the army. At the beginning of the Second World War, and during the invasion of Poland, he would work as a chief of staff for the 7th Army. The 7th Army would work defending the French border region at the start of the war, and Anton Dostler was involved in making sure that Germany was not invaded, at any part, by the French or enemy forces. At the time, the Germans were on the offensive, and were not the defensive ones. and the armed forces on their enemies were concentrated on fighting them on their own lands rather than invading. This meant that Dostler's job was relatively easy and straightforward. After this job, Dostler was then given a role as a commander, and he would be liked by Hitler and was also well trusted by other members of the Wehrmacht High Command. He would oversee the 57th Infantry Division in 1941 and 1942, and the division then saw action inside of Poland following the invasion. But then they would be transferred to take part in the invasion of the Soviet Union, and Dostler commanded the units during the early part of Operation Barbarossa, and this was when the Germans were rampaging into different lands and countries, and they would capture different villages and towns. But Dostler then moved over yet again, and was placed in command of the 163rd Infantry Division in 1942, and these also fought in the Soviet Union. They fought in the thickest presses of the Soviet Union, and were even deployed close to the Arctic Circle. But further transfers came for Anton Dostler, and he then commanded the 7th Army Corps, and was moved from the Eastern Front to work inside of Italy, and he served as the commander of the Venetian coast. He was a man who was very well trusted, and was seen as a competent general inside of Italy, and he would be responsible for a war crime that would secure his execution. On the 22nd of March 1944, there were 15 American soldiers, including 2 officers, who landed onto the Italian coast. They would land 15 kilometres north of La Spezia, which was deep behind enemy lines. This was Operation Ginny 2, a mission in which the American commandos would try to conduct sabotage upon the German army during the Italian campaign. The plan was to blow up railway tunnels, which would break off communications and transport links for the Germans in central Italy. A previous attempt to do this failed as the commandos could not find the tunnels, but a second try saw the American soldiers being dropped again in the wrong place. These men were dressed in proper American uniform. They did not have civilian clothing. They were dressed in the correct uniform, that if they should be captured, they should have been treated as prisoners of war. 3 of them did wear paratrooper boots, and some did have their jackets turned inside out to hide any American Army insignia. They had no markings that said they were linked to the Office of Strategic Services, and they were armed with Colt 45 pistols, fighting knives, and 6 of the men had machine guns. The plan was to destroy a tunnel at Framura, between La Spezia and Genoa, but the men knew they were in the wrong place and wrong area. They then had to try and hide out, before they would hopefully be rescued, and they would hide in the day and then during the night try to establish contact with their PT boats, and then try to carry out the mission. The Americans left their rubber boats and explosives to blow the bridge where they could, and near to Carpeneggio they found an empty barn. But on the 23rd of March 2 men tried to find food, and then encountered a farmer who did help them. But around the same time, an Italian fisherman spoke with local fascist policemen, who then found the boats of the Americans, and they then located the explosives. These then spoke to the German command detachment, and then a search party was assembled to sweep the area. But all of the 15 soldiers who were hiding inside of the barn were captured following a short bit of fighting. They were then taken to the German headquarters of the 135th Fortress Brigade, based in La Spezia. 14 of these men did not give over any information. However, one would tell under torture the full information of the commando raid and how they were planning to blow up the tunnels. This was then sent to the offices of Anton Dostler and the headquarters of the 75th Army Corps, and Dostler then spoke to his superior, Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, about what had happened. Dostler wanted to know what to do with the prisoners, and then Kesselring said the men should be executed in accordance with the commando order. The decree stated by Hitler that any Allied commando should be executed without trial. One of Dostler's assistants had refused to sign the order, as he knew these men were in proper uniform and that they should have not been executed. But Anton Dostler would be the one who signed off the execution order, and Colonel Almers, a man of the 135th Fortress Brigade, was ordered to carry out the execution, but he did not want to do this. He asked Dostler to delay, but Dostler refused to allow any concessions. There were further attempts to stop the Americans, but all 15 of them were executed in the morning of the 26th of March 1944 at Punta Bianca. The American soldiers were lined up by the Germans on a rocky outcrop, and they were then executed and were buried in a mass grave. It was this order that resulted in Anton Dostler himself being sentenced to death. Following the invasion of Italy, he was captured, and the American forces took him as a prisoner of war, but they discovered what had occurred with the commando team. Because of this, Dostler was found responsible, and he was placed on trial on the 8th of May 1945, and he was accused of war crimes. His military tribunal occurred at the seat of the Supreme Allied Commando, based in the Royal Palace in Caserta, and it would be the first Allied war crimes trial of World War II. Dostler was accused of having carried out an illegal order which violated the Geneva Convention, and it resulted in the murder and slaughter of Allied soldiers. Dostler claimed that his superior, Kesselring, had issued the executions, and that Dostler had just passed this on, but he claimed that the executions of the Americans was lawful, but he tried to wash his hands with the responsibility. However, this was not accepted, and despite appealing for clemency, Anton Dostler was found guilty of war crimes. It was said he was in violation of Article 2 of the 1939 Geneva Convention on Prisoners of War, and that no soldier, and still less a commanding general, can be heard to say that he considered the summary shooting of prisoners of war as legitimate, even as a reprisal. But Dostler was a convicted war criminal, and the appeals were based upon the clothes that the Americans were wearing, as if they were found to have been in disguise as civilians or German soldiers, then their executions would have been deemed lawful, as they would have been classed as enemy spies. But due to the fact they were wearing American uniforms, it was classed as a war crime. But Anton Dostler was sentenced to death, and the execution would take place inside the Italian city of Aversa. He was to die by a firing squad, as a soldier would have wished for his execution. A 12-man group of American soldiers were gathered for this, and they were assembled before 8 a.m. on the 1st of December 1945. But Dostler was then brought out from his prison cell, and he was taken to a firing range. At the bottom of the range was a stake, and he was tied to the execution post, and his arms were bound, as were his legs. A black hood was then placed over his head, and the officer in charge then gave the order to fire. He was killed instantly, and following his execution, his body was gathered and was wrapped in a white cloth before it was buried in a German war cemetery. But Anton Dostler was a very prominent member of the German military, and he was a man who was well trusted by Hitler and other Wehrmacht generals. What signed his death warrant, though, was the fact he had signed off on the executions of American prisoners of war, who should have been given better treatment than they received. These men should not have been executed, but they should have been allowed to live out the rest of the war inside of a prisoner of war camp. Kurt Bruns was born in 1915, and during his early life he worked as a grocery clerk inside the German city of Stuttgart. But then in 1936, as Hitler was expanding his army illegally, Bruns joined the Wehrmacht, and then 3 years later he became an officer. He served during the Second World War in a number of capacities, and during a number of important battles, and he rose to the rank of Hauptmann in September 1943. He was a man who was married and he had a child. However, during the latter part of the Second World War, he would commit a number of war crimes, especially as the war was turning against the Germans. Between December the 16th and December the 20th, 1944, during the Battle of the Bulge, the Americans captured around 30 Wehrmacht soldiers, including a corporal, Heinrich Kauter. Kauter, during his interrogation, was spoken to by 2 fluent German-speaking American soldiers. But then on the 20th of December, around 300 American soldiers, including those who were interrogating, were captured by the German 2nd Battalion, the 293rd Volksgrenadier Regiment, 18th Volksgrenadier Division. These Germans were led in their attack and assaults by Kurt Bruns, who was operating in the Schönberg area. The American prisoners of war were then under armed guard, marched to a customs house, and Corporal Heinrich Kauter then went ahead of the prisoners of war as he escaped. Bruns was then in the street in front of the custom house when the prisoners arrived. But following this, 2 of the recently freed Germans then told Kurt Bruns that 2 of the American prisoners of war spoke fluent German. These were Kurt Jacobs, a 35-year-old staff sergeant, and Murray Zappa, a 20-year-old soldier. Bruns then told his men to retrieve those 2 German-speaking Americans, and they were lined up against the wall of a house by one of Bruns' men, Sergeant Werner Hoffman. Bruns then had all the other Americans march towards Beilaf, and then he asked Jacobs and Zappler if they interrogated his men in German. The crime was later told by Corporal Kauter, who was a communist who had been sent to a concentration camp, but he was then conscripted into the war as the Wehrmacht was suffering greatly from heavy losses. This man had no loyalty to the Nazis, and he said he had witnessed the murders of 2 American prisoners of war, who were executed for saying they were Jews from Berlin. With this, Kurt Bruns was then wanted for war crimes. Further information about the executions came to light, and Cowter said that the men were standing at attention with their backs to the firing squad, and that they were then shot in the back of the head. But it would not be long before Captain Kurt Bruns was arrested, as he was captured during the ongoing Second World War. He was arrested on the 7th of February 1945 and was then identified. He admitted to speaking to the American prisoners of war during the incident, and he said he did not organise their executions and had no role in it. He said that he had been informed of their deaths, which were carried out after he received orders from his superior prison cell to try and get a confession from him. But on the 13th of February 1945, American soldiers from the 12th Infantry Regiment found the executed bodies of Jacobs and Zappler. They were shoved in a small hole around 100 yards from the road. Bruns had previously been seized inside of a bunker, and despite the fact the war was still ongoing, he was brought to a war crimes trial for illegally executing the two men. The trial was allowed to take place, even considering that Bruns was considered a threat to the Americans, but the trial would only last one day, and throughout this he maintained his innocence. The trial occurred on the 7th of April 1945 inside of Düren, but many witnesses came forward and testified about the executions and what they saw. One witness said he had heard Bruns state that, regardless of whether Germany will win the war or not, I would devote my life to the destruction of the Jews. He was also rather arrogant, and he did not care for the witnesses and what they said, and the courtroom heard that the men wanted to surrender, but instead were shot dead. He was also accused of murdering more men before his capture, with prisoners of war being machine-gunned by Bruns himself. When the remains of the Americans were found, the two were found lying face up in a shallow grave, with them missing their boots, with these presumably being stolen by a German soldier. Another witness testified that she heard another German reporting on the executions of two Jews, that they were shot because of the German prisoners identifying them as the two who questioned them. Bruns was then condemned to death, and he was sentenced to death by firing squad. Following the short trial, the death sentence was actually removed, and the evidence against Bruns was considered circumstantial. There were different inconsistencies with the testimony of the witnesses, but the officials then did recommend that the death sentence should go ahead, and it was reinstated. The death sentence of Kurt Bruns was confirmed by Colonel Ernest Brannan on the 8th of May 1945. It was around 6 weeks later that the German captain was then executed. On the 15th of June 1945, he was taken from his prison cell to Densdorf, and specifically a gravel quarry, where a firing range was created. He would be the first Axis war criminal to be executed by the Americans during and after the Second World War. Around this time, the American military usually executed German war criminals by hanging, and at the time the firing squad was considered an honourable way to die, and an execution method which was reserved for soldiers. After the war, the Americans would hang most war criminals, but the firing squad remained in place for Bruns, as he was condemned to death during the war, and before the war had ended. Bruns was allowed to wear his German uniform to face his death, but it was stripped of its insignia. He was then secured to a post in the firing range and quarry, and he was given a black blindfold which was tied around his eyes. The firing squad were then readied, and they were told to take aim. Suddenly the firing squad shot straight into Kurt Bruns, and with this he was the first German war criminal executed by the Americans. That same day, 6 other Germans were shot by the US military in Densdorf. The other men were 4 SS soldiers and 1 Wehrmacht soldier, who were all executed for espionage. Captain Kurt Bruns was one of only 2 Nazi war criminals executed by the Americans using a firing squad following World War II. Almost 300 others were executed on the gallows instead, but he was the first war criminal executed by the US Army also. He was 30 when he was shot dead, and he was a man who was considered an ardent Nazi, who wished to execute those 2 Jewish men, as he wanted to follow Hitler's ideas on exterminating the Jews. Despite his trial being today probably unfair, and based on circumstantial evidence, he was convicted for his crimes, and there is little doubt that his actions resulted in the executions of 2 men during the final years of the war. It's believed that Kurt Bruns may have committed more crimes during the Second World War, and that he may have had many more victims than those which he was brought to trial for, and that the men under his command could have also committed many more atrocities. But tied to a stake with a blindfold wrapped around his eyes, he was executed in a quarry by the Americans. Lots did not want to join up and fight, but they were forced to do so with the threat of violence, executions, and resistance groups became furious at the fact patriots were being forced to join the army of their enemies. For example, around 90,000 people from Poland were forcibly conscripted into the German army. But these conscripts were also forced to conduct different roles as well as being in the military. One of these men, from the German army who was ordered to spy on the Americans in the final day of the war, was Richard Jarczyk. Jarczyk was part of the Volksgrenadier, which was a division of the German army formed in autumn 1944, following the loss of Army Group Centre to the Soviets and also the loss of 5th Panzer Army to the Allies in Normandy. But the Volksgrenadier Regiment was supposed to boost morale, as they believed they were fighting for their nationalistic lives. There were 78 Volksgrenadier divisions created, and the loss of manpower meant that new infantry divisions needed creating, and these were mostly defensive groups that would try and dig in and hold out. The units were given submachine guns and light automatic weapons. They would be focused in close combat with the Allies. They were given weapons such as the STG-44 and the Panzerfaust to take out Allied vehicles. They were organised around hardened veterans and NCOs and also officers, and then staffed with anyone that the replacement army could get their hands on. The unemployed were involved, as were those who were wounded and were recovering, and older men who were considered too old or unfit to fight were conscripted, and the teenagers and younger men were brought in to the group. They would fight in many different battles, including in eastern France. They would defend during Operation Market Garden, and also the Battle of the Bulge. But they also saw service on the Eastern Front, and in the final battles that the Nazis faced in Europe. Some divisions were noted to have performed well, but others it was said were rushed into battle with little training, and because of this they had little impact on the battlefield, or they were not the most effective. But Richard Jarczyk, despite being part of the Volksgrenadier Division, ended up in the Rhineland region, which was then occupied by the Americans in March 1945. The Americans had fought hard into Germany, and the Germans tried to continue to get the upper hand over the Allies, and because of this they employed a number of spies to work behind enemy lines to try and gather intelligence regarding Allied positions and movements. There were many different spies who would work in the final days of the war, as spies behind Allied lines for the Germans. There was a Polish teenager named Joseph Fender, who was caught spying for the Americans, and despite being very young, he was shown no mercy and was executed by a firing squad. It was very dangerous at this time in the war, and Richard Jarczyk, who was at the end of the day a German soldier as part of the Volksgrenadier, was told to work behind enemy lines. He would be given a strange assignment and was told to get rid of his uniform. But then he was wearing civilian clothes and he approached the American army, and he would offer to work for them almost as an official in helping to establish a civilian government in the area occupied by the Americans. He would want to establish some form of council, and the Americans were eager to hear what he had to say. Jarczyk was hired by the US, and it was said, in the Rhineland, a Polish Volksdeutsch named Richard Jarczyk infiltrated American lines, where he obtained civilian clothing from a sympathetic German woman, and in March 1945 got himself hired by the American military government detachment at Bruchweiler. Jarczyk was such a conscientious employee that he was soon considered for appointment as the Burgermeister of the local town, although his suspicious behaviour eventually gave him away. But eventually he was suspected and was then arrested by the American forces for spying. As he was wearing civilian clothes, he was said to have been in breach of the Geneva Convention with regards to how prisoners of war should be treated. He was not in uniform, which meant that he should have been considered an enemy spy. It's not known for certain how he was caught, but his activities brought him into interrogation, and rather quickly he was then brought to trial. On the 6th of April 1945, Jarczyk was accused of being a spy, and the evidence against him was put forward at his trial, and he would confess that he had been involved in special training missions for carrying out sabotage and espionage with regards to enemy American positions. He was also found to have been collecting information about the activity of the American army, which was then passed on to one of the Werwolf groups, who would then use this to try and carry out attacks against the Americans. Because of this, he was sentenced to death, and this was just weeks before the war in Europe would come to an end. On the 23rd of April 1945, Richard Jarczyk was led out to a firing range, and he was accompanied by many military policemen. He was led towards a stake, and his arms and legs were then tied together and secured. He was wearing civilian clothes and his glasses, as well as a large hat, on his head, and a priest remained with him in his final moments before everyone was told to back away. The firing squad, made up of Americans, was gathered, and they were told to stand ready with their rifles, and they raised them towards Richard Jarchik, who was tied to the stake. When the order to fire was given, they shot straight into the man condemned to death for spying, and he was executed just weeks before the war had come to an end in Europe. There were many spies who worked undercover during the Second World War, but if they were captured, they usually went the same way, execution by firing squad. Not too much is known about Richard Jarchik, except the fact he was a spy who was involved in gaining the trust of the Americans and then passing secrets and positions to the Germans. He was, like many spies, executed on a firing range, and he would be instantly killed by the American firing squad.